Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. And before we get into today's video, I just want to do the usual. So my name's Amber and I upload beauty, fashion and lifestyle content, and on Tuesdays I like to do a true crime video. So if they are the type of videos that you like to watch, then why not hit that subscribe button and come along and join my little family, and why not also give me a thumbs up and leave me a comment down below, and now we can get right in. So guys, before we get into today's case, I just want to, you're clearly thinking what's going on, she's got her makeup on, she's normally doing a makeup while doing a murder mystery case, what's the crack? Well, actually I've decided today I'm just going to do a simple sit down and let's talk about a case. So before we get into today's case, I actually managed to find this case through a book that my dad picked up for me from a charity shop. My dad was doing a little bit of charity shop hunting and he came across this book, and this is the 50 most amazing crimes of the last 100 years. This book is from 1936, so it's a pretty old book, and I actually came across a very interesting case when I was scanning through this book, and it was called the Green Bicycle Mystery, and it's actually the unsolved case of a lady called Bella Wright. And I was like, I need to talk about this, so I'm going to probably be drawing inspiration from this book in future because there's some good cases in there. So let's just get into today's case. So it was the summer of 1919 in a rural region of Leicestershire when a woman named Bella Wright was found lying dead by the roadside on the 5th of July 1919. Now, police at first thought this was an accident, and it just had the feelings of an accident. There was nothing at first that pointed to foul play, so they just assumed that it had been a horrible accident. But obviously things escalated and they soon came to realise that this wasn't all it seemed, and it definitely wasn't an accident and it was murder. So the reason that the case is called the Green Bicycle Case or the Green Bicycle Mystery is because Bella was actually seen cycling in the company of a man riding a green bicycle shortly before her death. I just want you to take into account this case happened in 1919. That's a hell of a lot of years ago. In fact, that's 101 years ago. You can imagine there is a lot of information, but not as much detail as you would get from a more modern case. So some details may be a little bit wishy-washy. We'll go with what we've got. So I just want to give you a quick overview about Bella before we get into discussing her case. So she was actually called by birth Bella Wright, but people knew her as Bella Wright. So when I go through, I will be referring to her as Bella because that's what people would call her. Born on the 14th of July 1897, and she was the eldest of 7 children. She was born to an agricultural labourer and his wife. She lived in a little thatched cottage with her mum, dad and all of her brothers and sisters, and they lived in the village of Stoughton, Leicestershire, which was 4 miles outside of Leicester. Bella attended school until she was aged 12, and then she began to work as a domestic servant, and then she subsequently obtained a job as a rubber hand at Bates & Co, which was a rubber factory in Leicester, which was approximately 5 miles from her home. She regularly travelled to work on her bicycle. People knew her around town for using her bike to carry out little chores or little, you know, anything that she had to do, you know, whether it be posting letters, going to visit family members. She used to use her bike to get around. That was like her form of transport. So she was well known for travelling around on her bike. Bella was always described as a really good looking, really friendly and well loved girl. She was 21 years old and she was engaged to be married to a Royal Navy stoker who was named Archie Ward, who served on the HMS Diadem, which was a training ship in Portsmouth. I'm just now going to get into what actually happened on the day of her death. So on Saturday the 5th of July, Bella had worked a night shift and she'd actually arrived home early, and she went to bed until 4 o'clock. Obviously she got in and decided she needed a good kip, and then she woke up sort of 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She then spent the late morning and early afternoon writing letters to friends and family, and knew that she needed to pop out to the post office to post them. So she decided to hop on her bicycle and go into town. There was a post office called Eventon Post Office, which wasn't too far away, and she wanted to go and post the letters, and then she was planning to go and visit her uncle, who was called George Measures, in Golby. So on her way to the post office, she actually bumped into a lady called Mrs. Powers. Now Mrs. Powers actually worked in the post office, and the two had like a little meet and greet, you know, had a little natter, a little chat like us women like to do, and then Mrs. Powers kindly offered to deliver the letters for her because she was heading in that direction anyway, and the two ladies parted ways. And Bella decided that instead of going straight to her uncle's, because the sky had changed and it looked like it wasn't going to be particularly great, the weather, it looked like it was going to rain, she wanted to head back home first to get a little rain mac, a coat for herself, and then she was going to head back out. So she went home, grabbed her coat, grabbed her rain mac, and headed back out to her uncle George's house, and she arrived at their house at around 7:25 p.m. Whilst Bella was at her uncle George's house, he actually noticed this strange gentleman on his sort of porch area. He'd stepped outside to take a delivery of groceries, and then he noticed this young man perched over a BSA green bicycle, and this man was wearing a grey flat cap and he had a raincoat tossed over his handlebars. George, however, didn't recognise the man, so he did ask the grocers if they knew anything about him or knew who he was or what he was doing outside of his property. So the greengrocers replied and said that they'd seen him riding earlier on in Galby with Bella, and the greengrocers themselves just assumed that he knew who Bella was and the pair of them were together. Although George found this strange because he didn't recognise the man and Bella had made no mention of him. George was quite unamused by this, and I don't think he was particularly happy that she was riding with this strange man that he knew nothing about, and he did decide to question Bella as to who this guy was. Obviously George knew his niece was engaged to a man in the Navy, so why was she hanging around with another strange man that he'd never met before? Bella assured her uncle that she didn't know the man at all, and he'd basically asked her for directions to this village that she knew nothing about, and she'd met him through cycling on the road to Galby, and the pair had just exchanged some nice polite conversation while riding together for a time. He also told her that he was from Great Glen, which was a town about 3.5 miles away from Southwest, which was about 3.5 miles southwest of Galby, and George wasn't overly assured by this, but he sort of took on board what his niece had said to him. Although her uncle did find it a little bit strange that this man was still hanging around outside, and he did sort of make comment about that to Bella, and Bella was like, well, if he's still out there, I'm just going to hang around a little bit longer until he sort of disappears, because I don't think they had any plans to be doing anything together. So she found it a bit strange that he was still waiting for her when there was no reason for him to be waiting for her. So it was then around about 8:30, so you're talking about an hour. So this guy's been waiting outside for around about an hour. Bella went outside the front of the house and she looked around, and this guy seemed to have gone. So she thought, you know what, this is now a great idea to sort of make my way out. So she just assumed that he got bored of waiting for her and that he'd headed off wherever he was heading to. And she looked outside and she thought, you know what, it's getting a little bit dark now, I think I need to sort of start to head home. So she got on her bike and decided to head home. So just as she began her ride home, this strange man on the green bike pops out from nowhere, and he freewheeled down the hill from the church towards Bella, greeting her saying, quote, "You've been a long time, I thought you'd gone the other way," end quote. Now what is quite funny is, obviously she assumed at this point that he had gone because they weren't together, and I don't know why he thought he was going to wait for her. She'd actually been joking to her uncle that, you know, I'm going to give him the slip and I'm going to try and get rid of him and all this, and then she assumed he'd disappeared, but then he sort of reappeared from nowhere. So the man was around 5'6", he had short brown hair and it had like flecks of grey through it. He was dressed in a shabby grey suit with a tie, a shirt, black boots, and he carried his raincoat over his shoulder. He spoke in a high-pitched, squeaky voice with a slight Cockney accent, and Bella didn't seem too alarmed that the man was waiting for her, even though she seemingly didn't know him. Some people are suspicious that maybe she did know him, even though she was making out that she didn't. As she walked away from the house, the stranger joined her in pushing his bike back up the hill in the same direction. They appeared to chat as they both mounted their bicycles and rode out of sight of the village. This was the last time her family saw her alive, as she rode with the stranger around 8:30 p.m. So then an hour later at 9:30, a man called Joseph Cowell, who was a local farmer, was herding his sheep along Burton Overy Road in the direction of Stretton, and Joseph approached a turn-off for Little Stretton and he noticed something lying in the road. Now it just looked like a big black lump. He wasn't quite sure what it was. He thought it was maybe a horse rug that had fallen off a horse or something that had fallen off a goods cart. He just didn't really know what it was, but he knew there was something. So he drew closer to this lump in the middle of the road, and he actually realised it was the body of a young woman. He picked her up and he obviously was intending to take her to his house to give her first aid, but I think as soon as he picked her up he realised that unfortunately Bella was already dead. When he lifted her from the ground, her head was lifeless, her body was limp, and at this point he realised there was nothing he could do to save her, and unfortunately Bella had already passed away. He then decided to place her body on the grass bank by the side of a road. So there was a lot of blood on her head, and where he had lifted her, where her body had originally laid, there was a lot of blood like pooled around where her head had been laid as well. So a few yards away, Joseph then discovered her bicycle, and he assumed that it had been like a tragic accident, you know, someone had knocked her off a bike or something had happened to cause her to come off a bike, something like that. At this moment in time, there was no assumption whatsoever that there'd been any foul play. So Joseph decides, look, I need the police, because obviously you're still going to get the police. It's a dead body, the woman needs to be identified, because at this point Joseph didn't know who she was, the police didn't know who she was, and it actually took a little while for her to be identified. So he wrote and he got the police to come to the scene. So at 10:30, so another hour later, a 31-year-old police constable called Alfred Howe arrived on the scene. And when he arrived at the scene with Joseph Cowell, he seen two men, and the two men had actually been asked to stand guard by Joseph because he wanted to protect the area to make sure if it was foul play that they could investigate it properly. They lifted the body of Bella back into the car where Alfred inspected her the best that he could. Obviously, you know, it's 10:30 at night, it's dark, so it wasn't the best place to be investigating a body, but he was doing the best he could at that time. He found very little clues as to what had happened to her, and she was wearing a hat and her clothing didn't appear disheveled or torn. She had a box of matches and a purse in her pockets, but there was little else that could be ascertained. There was nothing else, to no other information that he could gather. So shortly after this, they obviously called for the doctor to come and inspect the body, and the doctor was called Dr. Edward Williams, and he arrived on the scene, and Edward gave Bella's body a cursory inspection, and he took like a little look over, and he took note of the blood around her nose and her mouth, and he suggested that she'd either had a seizure or a hemorrhage and had fallen from her bike and obviously passed away due to this. So again, he was assuming it was a tragic accident, and he also speculated that she could have died from exhaustion or blood loss, though the cause of death could not be formally identified. When Edward inspected Bella's face, he noticed that she had bruising around her left cheek, and there was a large amount of blood that concealed the true extent of the damage. So obviously it just looked like she'd been in an accident because there was she was just covered in blood. There was nothing to gather from the body until they took it back to wash it down. So Alfred, the police inspector, decided to ride home, but he had a lot of doubt in his mind. He thought something wasn't quite right, and he wasn't quite happy to let it lie. He didn't believe that it was just a tragic accident. It seemed so much more than that, but he was struggling to argue it any other way because there was no evidence of a crash or any violence on the road, although things just weren't adding up for him. He arrived home, stepped down from his bike, and he decided that he needed to go back out again and investigate the case a little bit more. So the following day, which was Sunday the 6th of July, Alfred was not happy with what Edward the doctor had said, and he was like adamant he wanted to go out and re-evaluate the crime scene and see if he could find any more evidence. So he decided that he was going to return to the crime scene. Now at the same time, Bella Wright's mother, Mary Ann, had woke up to find that her daughter had not returned home from her ride the night before, and she decided to pop to the post office in Eventon to see if there'd been any word of where she was or if anyone had seen her. When she got to the post office, she then decided to report her daughter missing because no one had seen anything of her. She didn't realise that the police were yet to identify her daughter, who was lying lifeless in the chapel, ready to be autopsied. Once again, Alfred returns to the scene like I said he was going to. He's heading down the track and he's scouring everywhere to try and see if he can find any evidence or any information on what might have happened to her. His persistence paid off, and a mere 6 yards from the bloodstain where Bella's body was found, he discovered a spent bullet which was half wedged into a hoof mark in the road. It was either a cow or a horse's footprint, and this had obviously been pressed down into the ground by a hoof of some sort. He dug it out with his fingers and inspected it, and he had experience in the armed forces, so he's pretty sure he had a good idea that it was a .455 bullet, which was a fairly large calibre round that could have been shot by a pistol or a revolver, in particular that of a Webley revolver, which was a common issue in the armed forces during the First World War. Following the First World War, there had been an influx of firearms into the country as soldiers returned home from the war and they were carrying their weapons. So an ex-serviceman possessing a revolver or rifle was not altogether uncommon. He also wandered a little bit further down, and on a gate post he seen the remains of a dead crow, but he wasn't sure of how it could have been connected to her death. It was just a strange circumstance. So Alfred wasted no time in taking his discovery back to the doctor Edward. Edward then re-inspected the body of Bella Wright and did a more in-depth investigation on the body, and Alfred assisted Edward in doing the autopsy. And when they started to wash the body down and washed away the blood from her face, and he carefully lifted off her hat, which was still perched on her head, he made a further grim discovery. Bella had not died from a fall or a hemorrhage, there was actually a bullet wound. So on the left of her face, just beneath the eye, there was a bullet hole, and on the other side of her head, where her temple was, there was an exit wound. So Bella had definitely been murdered, and it was possible that the bullet that Alfred had found could have been the bullet that was fired at her. So it could have obviously gone in one side, gone out the other, landed in the ground, and then as you've had the horses or the cows trampling along, they've obviously stood on the bullet, which could certainly have been the bullet that was shot at her. So now the police have actually got a full-blown murder investigation underway. It's clearly murder, there's clearly something amiss. So Superintendent Herbert Taylor visited the scene, though he found little new evidence than what Alfred had found. However, he did go a step further with the strange dead crow, and he matched the bird's feet with prints upon the top of a wooden gate. The bird was sent for analysis, but nothing was found, and it still remains as mysterious as the night they found the body. There was no, I don't know whether it was just a coincidence, but there was no connection made. So now the body had been identified as Bella because her uncle George came forward and gave a really in-depth description of the man on the green bicycle. The police released a statement with the man's description in hopes someone would come forward who knew this person, or the person themselves would come forward, but there was no. So George had said that he was aged 35 to 40 years old. He had a height of 5'7" to 5'9". He was apparently usually clean shaven but had not shaved for a few days. His hair was turning grey. He had a broad full face and a broad build, and he said he had a squeaky voice and he spoke in a low tone. He dressed in a light rainproof coat with green plaid lining. He had a grey mixture jacket suit with a grey cap, a collar, a tie, black boots, and he was wearing cycling clips. So it was really nice that George had actually made a mental note of what he was wearing. And there was also a long description of the man's BSA bicycle and the request that if the man was spotted, he should be detained and the police should be contacted. The police put out a reward for £5 with a specific appeal to owners of all bicycle repair shops for any information. They just wanted to know what was going on and if anyone had any information about anything. So Harry Cox, a bicycle repair shop owner, came forward to the police with information stating that he'd repaired the bicycle described in the paper only 1 week prior. Unfortunately, the owner never gave his name, which suspicious to me. He clearly didn't want anyone to know who he was, but the owner confirmed that the man did definitely match the description that the police had of him, and he told the police that he knew that the man was from London and he was visiting friends in Leicestershire, which, if you remember rightly, people said he had a almost Cockney accent, so it makes sense that he is actually from London. The fact that the suspect was from London had both positive and negative effects on the investigation. Firstly, it made them looking for a man's name somewhat similar to finding a needle in a haystack. It was very difficult for them to pinpoint who this guy was. If the man wasn't local, he could have easily have been and done his business and slipped away back to where he was originally from, and how are you going to find him then? It was very difficult. And don't forget, this is 100 years ago. Policing is not as up to date as what it is now. They didn't have the technology back then that they do now, but there was a plus side because it was linked to London and there was a connection to London. It meant it felt under the Metropolitan Police's sort of jurisdiction, so it meant they could be involved in the case, and it meant that they could work together. So a chief inspector called Albert Hawkins was dispatched to Leicestershire to lend his expertise to the case. Albert would later become known as one of the big four superintendents that would head up the Criminal Investigations Department of Scotland Yard later that year. So basically they then decided to, everyone that knew Bella was interrogated to like the tiniest pinpoint. Like, they literally interrogated them to death, got all of the information they could. They even questioned her unofficial fiance Archie Ward, who travelled from Portsmouth to aid in the investigation. So the thing with Archie and Bella's relationship, it soon come out that I don't think their relationship was all that it seemed. Bella's mother had basically been straight and said that they were not engaged to be married, and the pair were both committing acts of infidelity. So it was almost like it was a show, like their engagement was just for show, and that she made out, her own mother said that they were both committing acts of infidelity, so whether that meant sleeping around or seeing other people behind each other's backs. So I don't think they were actually officially a couple. I think they were just making out like they were. So weeks passed and there was no new leads, and there was no like forthcoming information. Basically the investigation come to a very grinding halt. There was no weapon found, even though they'd searched and searched and searched. They didn't find a weapon, and the only thing the police were left to do was to reprint information in the paper with a reward to try and get someone to come forward. They printed like a second handbill with more information about the green bike and about the man to try and get people to come forward. But a year later, in 1920, the case was just cold. The case was dead in the water. It was a cold case, and they were no further forward to the day that Bella died. So on Monday the 23rd of February in 1920, Enoch Whitehouse, a canal haulier, was working along the canal delivering goods to various factories. As he approached the factory at St Mary Mills that Bella had previously worked at until her death, his tow rope got stuck on something, couldn't get it free, and he was thinking, there's something not right here, what's going on? When he pulled it up out of the water, his rope was actually tangled around a bicycle. He heaved it up to the side of the barge, and he recalled the story he'd read in the paper about the green bike. This bike that he pulled up was a match for what the police were looking for. He could not believe his luck, because obviously there was a reward for any information about the bike. So when he pulled this up, because his tow rope had got stuck, he was like, I can't believe my luck, I need to report this to the police. But it was even stranger the fact that this bike was found alongside the factory that Bella had worked at. I mean, this suggested the person know Bella. Did they not know Bella? Was it coincidence? Who knows? So Enoch obviously had a lot of deliveries on for that day, and he didn't really want to disturb his deliveries, so he made a note of where the bike was, put it back, and then went back at a later date. So the next day he returned and he hauled it back up and he brought it aboard and he took it directly to the police station. There were parts of the bike missing, but it was the first lead that they had had in months. This bike was clearly exactly the bike that they had been searching for. Enoch had got lucky and it was clearly the bike that they had been searching for. They immediately called a local BSA agent named William Saunders to inspect what was left of the bike. Unfortunately for the investigators, the hopes of re-sparking the investigation were premature, and this bike didn't prove to be as helpful as what they thought it would be. Obviously it's been in the river for over a year. There I think were serial numbers and things missing, so it was a little bit more difficult than what was once thought. Just as their hopes for the case were starting to get dashed, this William had mentioned that if the bike was by special order, then they're normally given like multiple serial numbers. Actually stamped him to the handlebar was a second serial number, so it was tucked up where no one would even consider looking. Like, no one would have any knowledge of that being there. Everything else had been stripped because obviously people, whoever's bike it was, didn't want them to know that it was their bike, but this serial number was still there, and it was a 6-digit number, and it was 103648. So the BSA officers in Redditch unearthed files for the bike and found it was manufactured in 1910 to fulfill a special order. So this bike was specially made. It was dispatched to a dealer in Derby named Autumn Brothers, and the Autumn Brothers kept very good records of their sales. Police finally got closer to discovering who this mystery man was. The police visited the dealership in Derby and they spoke to Joseph Orton, who flicked through his store records, and he discovered that the bike was bought in cash by a guy called Ronald Light. And when he gave his contact information, when this Ronald gave his contact information to Joseph, he actually gave him 2 addresses. The police then hit another brick wall when they discovered that the 2 addresses that he'd given to Joseph, he no longer lived at either of them, so it was getting quite difficult for them to find him. But they had a paper chain, so they just kept following this paper chain to try and find him, and they followed the paper chain to get his current address, which was in Cheltenham, which was around 75 miles away from Leicestershire, and he was actually teaching as an assistant schoolmaster in a well-to-do private school. So on the 4th of March, the police decided to visit the school he was teaching at, which was called Dean Close School, and they had a brief conversation with him. He said at first that he'd never owned the BSA bicycle and he didn't know anything about it, and then he changed his story quickly and decided to tell them that he did own it, but he only owned it for a short amount of time and then he sold it. So he was like constantly changing his story to the police. He told detectives that he'd never heard of Bella Wright and he'd certainly never visited Galby. So the police were not buying what he was selling, and the police decided they wanted to take him into the station and investigate him a little bit further. So they took him to the station and they took him into an interview room, and in this interview room they actually compiled like a a rundown of 10 different men, and what he didn't realise was through this glass screen was Henry Cox, who was the bike repairman that Ronald had took the bike to have it repaired after all the issues, and Henry formally identified him as the guy that he had repaired the bike for. So now Ronald was arrested on charge of murder. It started to become clear to the police that for all he was working as this reputable teacher in this school, that maybe his past wasn't all that it seemed to be. He had a definite dark past and he was lying to the police. So I'm just going to give you now a little bit of a backstory about Ronald so you can understand who he is. 34 years old at this point, and he was born in 1885 to parents George and Catherine. His mother Catherine had been from a particularly wealthy family, and his earliest years were comfortable. He didn't have to worry for nothing. He attended a prep and private school. However, at the age of 17 he was actually expelled for inappropriate behaviour with another female student, and it was actually a younger pupil. It was claimed that he'd lifted a girl's skirt over her head, but the police and a lot of people suspect that this was actually maybe paid off and it was downplayed, and that actually there was more serious claims than what had been reported. He then finished his schooling at City and Guilds in London and accepted an engineering apprenticeship with Midland Railway in Derby. In 1910 he was aged 25 and he completed his training to become an assistant engineer. He worked there for 4 years and he was well liked by his work colleagues. That was until he was fired, because he actually set fire to a storeroom, and he also was discovered drawing graffiti on bathroom walls. His dismissal sort of fell right on the time that people were getting drafted for the war, so he ended up enlisting to the war. He was drafted into a position of second lieutenant of the Royal Engineers and was sent to France in 1915. He constructed trenches and helped prepare for the Somme offensive. His war experience would not last long. He was only there for 10 weeks when he was sent home, and it soon began to spread along the trenches that he had been sent home for assaulting a postmistress, for sexually assaulting a postmistress. The official reason given was actually that he lacked incentive as an officer, but rumours swirled and this clearly wasn't the case. So soon after his abrupt return home, his father fell from a second-storey window and died, though it was never proven. People believe that his father actually committed suicide. So Ronald spent the summer of 1916 working as a farm labourer before he decided to re-enlist as a gunner in the reserves. He obviously clearly didn't ever expect for them to call for him. Obviously they did. Him and his regiment were actually called for twice, and they actually received orders on the eve of their departures both times to say that they were to stay home and await further orders, which made no sense because this fighting was going on and it was destroying a lot of lives in France, and the demand for manpower was very large. So why were they telling these men not to come over? Well, that is because Ronald had something to do with it. When they looked into it, when the powers that be, you know, his big bosses, started to look into it, they realised that the reason his regiment was getting kept home was because Ronald was actually sending the orders himself. They did handwriting tests on all of his regiment and it come back that he was writing these orders himself, and he was actually sending the orders to the regiment leader on 2 occasions so that the leader would cancel their call-up. He was actually sentenced to jail for this. He got 1 year imprisonment, but because the demand for men again was so high, he was actually released after 4 months, and he was finally sent back to across the channel in 1917. This time he served 10 months as a gunner. Eventually he was sent home with deafness and ringing in his ears. He spent 3 months in a military hospital, at which point the war had ended, and in February 1919 he was officially demobilised and he was returned to Leicester to live with his mother, where he stayed until taking the position as an assistant schoolmaster in Cheltenham on the 20th of January 1920. He'd only been at the school for 3 months before the police came for Ronald Wright, the man who owned the green bicycle. So the following day, after the police had arrested him, he was transported back to Leicester Station, where he would be sent for extensive questioning, and he was obviously awaiting in his trial. The police attempted to build a case against him, and they were exhaustively dragging the canal to try and figure out if there was any more evidence that could be found. The rear wheel and other various parts were still missing, and the murder weapon still remained a mystery, and I think they were hoping that by dredging this river they were going to find both the murder weapon and the rest of the bike. So among the lines of inquiry in building the case against Ronald, there was a conversation that had gone on between 2 young girls and a man on the evening of the murder, and that was Muriel Nunley, who was age 14, and Valeria Calvin, who was 12, and they both gave a statement to the police that they had seen a man on a green bike that had approached them whilst out riding. And this man had approached them and he tried to separate them and asked them if they were riding alone, and the girls wisely declined his request to, I think that he was trying to say, oh, I'll take you home, and they were like, no sorry, we don't talk to strangers. In a lineup they both pointed Ronald out immediately, and Ronald was trying to claim that, you know, these lineups were becoming unfair because the girls actually got to pick him out in a lineup. He was making all sorts of excuses, that he hadn't shaved and that people had seen his photo before. You know, these girls were they'd regularly seen his photo around, so they knew what his face looked like, and he was trying to say that the girls' statements weren't taken until after the arrest, so his photographs had already been printed in local papers, so that the police were intentionally setting up lineups against him on purpose. So he was trying to discredit what the police were doing, basically. The trial against Ronald kept getting pushed back all of the time because the police were continuing to dredge the canal to try and find more and more information, you know, if they could find the rest of the bike or the gun, and he was placed on remand on both occasions. When he appeared in court, he stayed cool and calm. So on the 12th of March, the rear wheel was found along with a rear braking mechanism which matched the serial numbers of the green frame, and a week later, a brown leather army revolver holster full of .455 cartridges were pulled up, though still the weapon itself remained ever elusive. So they'd found matching bullets in this holster, but they still hadn't found a gun, but they did find more parts to the bike. So on the 23rd of March, Ronald once again was brought before a judge to undergo magisterial proceedings. The case was laid out before the court, in particular the new evidence that had come to light, and the prosecution claimed that they had evidence that could show, although there was no firearms found in Ronald's possession, he had owned a service revolver as late as 1915. Ronald's family had a servant called Mrs. Webb, and she obviously lived in the house. She was clearly like a housemaid or something, and she knew he used to regularly go on bike rides, and he loved this bike, and he was always out and about. And then after the death of Bella, the bike sat in the kitchen for months and months and months on end, and he didn't want to touch it and he didn't go out on it. Then all of a sudden it just disappeared completely. So the case was building up very strongly against Ronald. So the question of motive was being brought up, and it was quite difficult to... The police had everything else, but they couldn't sort of come to a decision on what the motive was. It was difficult for them to prove a motive. Yes, he was seen in her company within the last half an hour of the girl's life, but that was half an hour before she was found dead. What's to say they parted ways before she was found dead? So it was then suggested that he would be sent for a trial. So at the end of the proceedings that lasted 2 full days, he was then committed to stand trial for the murder of Bella Wright. And the only thing that Ronald could say was, quote, "I am innocent, and by the advice of my legal advisors I reserve my defence," end quote. So in the run-up to the trial, things fell very quiet in the case of Bella Wright. There wasn't a lot of press talking about it. Ronald was trying to organise his defence, and his mother and a wealthy family friend were aiding him, and they actually secured services of a guy called Sir Edward Marshall Hall to stand his defence. lawyer, and this guy was no ordinary defence lawyer. This guy was the shit. Beat around the bush. He knew his shit. He knew what he was doing. He was a good lawyer. He was schooled at Rugby in Cambridge, and he was well known for his impassioned defences. After a string of successful high-profile cases, he'd become known as the Great Defender. So this was a difficult one because he was a very good defence lawyer. It is argued that he's considered to be the best defence lawyer of his time. Some people still argue to this day he's the greatest legal figure of today. So he was clearly a really good legal defender, and their family had money enough to pay him, so why wouldn't you get your son the best legal defence? So the trial opened up on June 9th, and the case had fallen quiet in the press. Like I said, there'd been not much talk about it. Ronald arrived at 10 AM by police van. He was dressed very smartly in like a dark suit, and he was pressed. He was adamant he was going to stand there, and he was pleading not guilty. Prosecution was carried out by Attorney General Sir Gordon Hewitt, whose opening statement once again mentioned the question of motive, alluding to the idea that the attack could have been one of revenge, whereby Ronald had made advances towards Bella, and she had obviously she'd rebuffed these advances. He also commented on the quality of evidence and stated that although much may be circumstantial in nature, if it at all pointed in the same direction, it was not necessarily open to criticism on quality. So the remainder of the day was then given to witness examinations, and after briefly pointing out the key locations of the case, it did not take long for the Great Defender to strike. During a cross-examination of young girls, Muriel, Nunny and Valeria Calvin, these were the girls who had said they'd had a conversation with him. Muriel was asked if she saw the man from the roadside meeting in court. Muriel replied in the positive and pointed to Ronald Light. Hall then addressed her, and he said, "Did you hear what was called the green bicycle case?" And she said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I think you saw the photographs." And she said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "You knew about this poor girl being found dead in the road?" And she said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "You read it in the papers, I suppose?" And she said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You were asked whether you seen this particular man on the 5th of July?" And she said, "Yes." And then he said, "Hall, the police gave you the date?" And she said, "Yes, sir." With minimal effort on his part, the defence had shown that the girl's statements were not only taken after the arrest of Ronald Light, but after the case, and the arrest had been made in public press after the girls had read about it. So it made it look like the girls were coerced into saying this to the police, the police had coerced them into saying it. The girls' evidence was thrown out entirely by a judge. He then questioned Edward, who was the autopsy guy, Bella's body, and he was asked about them being firearms experts, and he'd already explained in court that he was not a firearms expert, and the doctor had to concede that no, he was not a ballistics expert. So these were all punching holes in the cases that the police had built up. So the second day of the trial was just as hectic as the first, and this was when the jury would finally hear what Ronald Light had to say, what his movements on the day were and the murder. And they questioned him, and he was asked about his revolver, and he said that he'd not seen it since he'd left the army, so he was trying to deny having any sort of gun. Ronald did admit that even though he didn't own a gun anymore, that he did still own ammunition, and that the ammunition that had been fished out of the river was his. He also maintained that he'd never met the two girls, and that riding out that evening was the first time that he'd ever met Bella. So Ronald admitted to meeting Bella that day, and what his story was that he had seen Bella leaned over by the roadside and there was an issue with her bike, and Bella had actually approached him and asked him if she could lend a spanner. There was an issue with her wheel, and he had sort of helped her out and followed her through to her friends, and she'd said, "Look, I'm only going to pop and see my friends, I'll literally be 15 minutes. And Ronald assumed that she meant that this was "Oh, just wait for me and we can ride back together." He took it that sort of way. Ronald, after waiting for 15 minutes, said that he did go to leave the village, assuming that Bella was not going to come back. However, when he approached the church, he noticed his rear tyre was flat and he had a puncture. So he mended the puncture, which took him about an hour or so. So he's trying to say, "I wasn't moseying on about outside her uncle's house. I had a problem with my bike and I needed to mend my puncture, and that's why I was still outside when she came out the house." And he coasted down on his bike to see where Bella had to go to, only to meet her as she was leaving her uncle's house. Upon his approach to the house, he said, "Hello, you've been a long time." This went against the statements from Bella's uncle and cousin, who said that the man had approached and said, "Bella, you've been a long time," as if he knew her. But Ronald insisted that Howe had never known her name until he read it in the reports of the murder in the paper. He continues his story that the pair left Uncle's house. So he basically went on to say that they'd rode to this hill and his tyre was an issue again. His tyre had gone down, and he was explaining to her that I was still outside when you come out because there was something wrong with my tyre. She'd like explained that she would never let her tyres on her bike get that bad because she worked at a tyre factory, and she could always replace them for like a cheap cost price. So they then come to this junction, and she basically got off a bicycle and said, you know, "Lovely to meet you, but I'm going to say goodbye to you here. I'm going this way and obviously you're going that way." He found it strange because the way she was pointing wasn't the shortest way to get to Leicester. The way he was going was actually the shortest way to get to Leicester, but they basically said their goodbyes and he agreed to part ways because he just wanted to get home as quickly as possible because he was already running late due to his tyre being flat. And he then claims that after this he never seen her again, and that it took him some time to reach home as he had an issue with his tyre. And this was confirmed. It was confirmed that he did arrive home late by the servant. When she'd actually approached him and been like, "Oh, you're late, like what's happened to your bike?" He did tell her that it had broken down and he'd had problems with the tyres. So then he was questioned about what his reasons were in terms of why he was disposing of the ammunition and the gun holster. He said, quote, "Well, for the first day I ever saw the accounts, every paper was saying the man who had ridden the bicycle had murdered a girl. In retrospect, he could of course see that his actions were not sensible and that he could have helped the police to switch their line of inquiry to other suspects if he'd simply come forward. However," he went on and said, "I did not make up my mind deliberately not to go forward. I was astounded and frightened at this unexpected thing. I kept on hesitating and in the end I drifted into doing nothing at all." So one of his reasons for staying silent was that he didn't want to worry his mother, who was suffering from a poor heart, and that he was not guilty or a suspect. So he basically thought that he knew he wasn't guilty or a suspect, so he didn't know any reason or any way that he could actually help the police. So he just tossed his belongings into the canal to avoid any suspicion, so they couldn't be traced to him, which is suspicious. So Hall, the defence lawyer for Ronald, actually stood in court for 2 hours. For 2 hours, and gave a speech about why his story was plausible and how it couldn't have been him, and basically obviously fully defending him like his job is, and basically was disproving everything that the police had put out there. After this 2 hours, the jury were then forced into this predicament of, well, actually, even though Ronald's testimony does sound very cowardly and very like, well, why didn't he just come forward and say something if he's not got anything to do with it? It's entirely understandable and plausible for some reason for some people as to why he wouldn't want to say anything. So after this 2 hour long speech, the jury stepped out and to make their decision, and after just 3 hours they returned and found that Ronald Wright was not guilty. So Ronald Wright had escaped the guilty verdict, and as such the case of Bella Wright fell into a new mystery. If not Ronald Wright, then who was the murderer? And there are 3 main theories which have persisted over the last 100 years. The first 2 of which are fairly straightforward. Either you accept the position of the prosecution that Ronald had in some way made an advance upon Bella and shot her in a revenge of rebuttal, or that perhaps he was a cold psychopath shooting her with no motive at all. The second, that you accept the position of the defence that Ronald was innocent and merely concealed his tracks through fear of being prematurely painted as a criminal. The third theory is a little different, however. In the vacuum of the trial's aftermath, the public responded quickly, and after only 2 days, the Leicester Post printed a story coming from the Daily Mail concerning the dead crow that was found in the field by the murder scene. What if it was suggested the girl was not murdered at all? 2 correspondents were advancing fresh possible solutions of the mystery. The first comes from a barrister. This is the excerpt from the newspaper, who says he does not believe the girl was murdered at all. He suggests that the key to the mystery is the dead raven found gorged with blood in a field nearby the body, and which had left traces of blood on top of a gate adjoining the road. I doubt very much whether this creature was in reality gorged with human blood, says the barrister. On the contrary, it seems to me not improbable that it was shot by a boy or some other irresponsible person, and that the bullet went on and killed Mrs. Wright. I should like to know whether it is a scientific fact that a raven may so gorge itself with human blood as to die. The other correspondent, a naturalist, asked by whom the raven was examined, and also expresses doubt whether it would gorge itself until it died. It is far more likely, he said, that the bird was shot and bled internally. This theory was not overlooked in 1922. Writer Truman Humphreys published the shooting crows theory in an article he wrote for the Strand magazine in a peculiar, fact-based, fictional mashup of events. In it, Humphreys accepts Ronald's version of events, that he did not come forward due to shell shock, not wanting to concern his mother due to poor health, but expands the entire concept of the dead crow. Here he veers into fiction, suggesting that a young boy hunting rabbits could have been lying on the floor with a rifle perched on the edge of a cattle trough. Indeed, there was a trough on the field adjacent to the scene. The shot was fired towards the crow, hitting both the crow and Bella at once, so it was like an accidental shooting. The reality is, however, the bird was examined, and if it had been shot with a .445 caliber bullet, it would have been likely that it would be blown to pieces. This did not necessarily make the story any less true. What if the bird was shot at all, but either missed or only clipped by the bullet, shooting Bella instead? The bird could have still gorged on the blood of the victim before dying, just as the original evidence heard. Would it have gorged itself on the blood in the first place? There is a considerable ornithological evidence against this idea. Or what if the bird had been shot by a much smaller bullet than the .445 found in the road? Could it have been a .455 bullet was a red herring all along? They were commonplace at the time, though it would have been a remarkable coincidence that a spent bullet could have been found in the road by a shooting victim and be entirely unrelated. There is evidence to suggest it is just that. The medical evidence shows a wound would have been relatively small for a bullet size of a .445 bullet. Hall himself mentioned in the trial that the effect of such a bullet on the human skull is almost to blow the side of the head off, and in a letter dated after the trial, he believed the bullet to be nothing but a coincidence. There is one late twist to the tale that is a letter of discovery only discovered recently. For a long time there existed rumours that there was some sort of signed confession by Ronald that had been floating around a Leicester police station. However, it was often thought to be something of an urban legend. No one could ever produce the letter upon inquiry. In much recent years, however, author Anthony Brown managed to unearth an attempt to authenticate a document which he believes was the seed for the legend of the signed statement. The document in question was found by Bill Donahue in 2007 when he found it amongst a stack of old documents in Leicester police station. He wrote about it in an article for a bicycling magazine on the case. The document had been stored at Leicester County Records for the past 8 to 10 years. Before that, it had remained a secret, known as the Bowley Statement. It is a typewritten statement made by Superintendent Levi Bowley. It tells of how, when in custody, Ronald had gotten along well with Bowley on account of his fair treatment towards him, and of how 3 days after his acquittal, Ronald came to collect his possessions from the police station. Upon doing so, Bowley reached out to Ronald. I told him that I did not believe he'd willingly shot her, and I never believed that of him. Well, you're a good sport, Ronald replied. If I tell you something, can I depend upon you keeping it to yourself? Obviously, Bowley wants to know what's gone on, so he cannot resist but say, of course I'll keep it to myself. Like, please tell me, tell me what you've got to tell me. So he went on to tell Bowley an alternative story of the facts of the murder of Bella Wright. He said, quote, "I did shoot the girl, but it was completely accidental. We were riding quietly along. I was telling her about the war and my experiences in France. I had the revolver in my raincoat pocket and we dismounted for her to look at it. I had fired off some shots in the afternoon for a practice and I had no idea there was a loaded cartridge in it. We were both standing by the two sides of the bicycle. I think she had dismounted on the right of her machine and that the two bicycles were between us. I took the revolver from my coat pocket and was in the act of handing it to her. I am not sure whether she actually took hold of it or not, but her hand was out to take it and then it went off. She fell and never stirred. I was horror struck. I did not know what to do. I knew she was dead. I did not touch her. I did not know the girl. I had met her before that evening. What I said about her asking me for a spanner was quite true. I first saw her at the top of a hill. I screwed her bicycle up and we went down the hill and started to go up the next hill where Atkins saw us. I did not make an improper suggestion to her either on the way to Galby or after leaving there. I did not mention this at all. That might and probably would have happened later. If I had intended in shooting her, I should never have done it close up to the village. It was much more lonely along the road we had passed. I do not remember the two little girls. They must have mistaken me for someone else. Bowley then replied to him, does your mother know? He said, my God, no. I would never let my mother know it for the world. No one on this earth knows it but us two. And if you tell, I shall never say I did anything of the kind. The document is signed by Superintendent Bowley, and it raises many more questions than it does answers. So they wanted to investigate this piece of paper to see if it had any authenticity. So they actually said that the paper itself was dated to come from around the 1950s. It could have been manufactured any time before the 1950s, and that the signature was said to match Bowley's actual signature, but there was acceptable margin for error. They can't give this document 100% authenticity. They think it's a high possibility that it could be true. So the question I leave you with was, do you believe Ronald Light was guilty or innocent of either murder or manslaughter, or perhaps neither? The green bicycle mystery of 1919 is no clearer today than the day that it happened. The facts are still no clearer, and the mystery of how Bella Wright dies steadily rolls onwards. We are still no further forward to solving this case. I would absolutely love to know your thoughts and feelings on this one. Please let me know down below. Do you think that Ronald had anything to do with it? Do you think it was a hunting accident, possibly? I definitely think Ronald had something to do with it. I think there's far too many coincidences. I don't know whether it was foul play or whether it was accidental. Couldn't tell you, but given his history, it wouldn't surprise me if it was foul play. I'd just be interested to know your thoughts, feelings and opinions on this one. It's such an interesting case now. It's over like 100 years old, 101 years old. It's very interesting to figure out what your thoughts and feelings are. I don't think this one will unfortunately ever get solved, because like I say, I do feel like the killer has already been caught, whether that be accidental or deliberate. But yeah, let me know your thoughts and feelings down below. Anyway guys, I hope you've enjoyed watching this True Crime Tuesday, and I shall see you in the next one. Mwah.